So welcome everyone. If you guys joined after just recently, please go ahead, answer the poll that we have live. And then today we're going to talk about, Adobe OptIn and integrating OneTrust, and sharing some lessons that this team of experts here have learned. Some insights and some tips that they learned after implementing, this solution for OneTrust, OptIn, and Adobe OptIn for consent management. And the agenda will be, we're talking about, welcoming people right now. And then we're going to do some intros. We're going to go into the content. It's going to be moderated content. I'll ask some questions to the experts here. Then we'll open it up for Q&As. And then for those that do have Q&As, we have free t-shirts that we can give out for the first 3 people that ask a question. We can only ship to the US, but still, if you have a question, go ahead, ask it. And, if you really want it, we'll try to figure out something, if we can, to ship the t-shirt to where you are, if you're outside the US. Okay, so with that said, who is here? So our panelists include me. So I'll be the moderator. I lead the digital analytics practice at Softcrylic. I go by Analytics Sensei, and I'm just happy to be here with these group of experts. Raj.
Yeah, my name is Raj, and I'm a data and digital analytics expert here at Softcrylic. I've been around here for more than 2 years, and I'm based out of New Delhi. My core expertise comes around Adobe marketing solutions, especially analytics. Yeah, that's pretty much about me. Over to you, Jay.
Thanks, Raj. Hi, everybody. My name is Jay Sherwood. I am an Adobe principal consultant, focused largely on the analytics product, but analytics, as we all know, touches a lot of different products. So I've been involved with everything basically that gets involved with analytics, and I have been at Adobe since 2009. Justin?
Wow. Nice. And hello, everyone. My name is Justin McCain. I serve as the Global Senior Product Manager here for International Data Privacy at Behrens, really focusing with the data privacy tool OneTrust and integrating the consumer experience for privacy into our entire marketing stack over a period of time for our digital transformation. So that's me, and looking forward to sharing some of our goals and accomplishments today.
All right. Excellent. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and, to contextualize what we're going to talk about today, when we think about data privacy and all the regulations, right, it encompasses a lot of facets in an organization, right? Each part's more important than the next. But what we're going to talk about today is we're going to zero in on a very specific topic around data collection and consent management. And so I have a list of questions I'd like to ask this team. As I ask you guys, feel free to jump in, any one of you, if you have any additional context to add. Sound good?
Yep.
So we'll start with you, Justin. You're here. You're leading the data privacy, for Bayer Crop Sciences. My question is, why is consent management a business requirement nowadays?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so, for Bayer Crop Science, we are a company that owns over 250 brands, but then we have websites, right, in the hundreds, and we're doing business in a multitude of different countries. What we found out back in 2017 and 2018 was that there were multiple privacy regulations that would start popping up at the local level. And we would handle that by working with our privacy team, aligning with our IT team to go and execute on that privacy regulation. We'd solve it, and then we'd have to go and maintenance that thing in that one particular country, and then a new regulation would come up. Over a period of time, we really saw this need to create a holistic view of privacy at this global level. And the numbers that I want you guys to think about in context as we talk today are the numbers 66 and 10. 66% of the world today, right, has privacy regulations that are live right now, that if you do business in these countries, you're going to have to be compliant with those regulations specific to that country. But then there's another 10% of the world that has regulations in draft. That means 2/3 of the world have requirements over data privacy, where we're not just putting privacy on top of a digital experience, it has to now be a part of your omni-channel experience. And so for us, we found that this was a requirement. We were already going through a digital digital transformation with Adobe, where we were implementing that in all of our websites across the world. And so we found this natural synergy where we could implement some new harmonious and holistic solutions so that we were getting away from doing things at the local level and at the global level. And so for us, we don't want to be associated with what happens if we are not complying with regulations. We want to honor user consent, but we want to do so in a reasonable and logical way. And so for us, we started making privacy a requirement so we could have a framework and so we could do it over a period of time in a way that made sense in the future.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, those numbers are really something. I have here a slide that really brings that to life. You know, so out of 194 countries, 132 have active legislation, right? And the 66% of those countries, you know, that's the regulation, right? That's the number of countries, the percentage of countries, right? 10% have draft legislations, and then the rest no legislation, right? So that really brings it to life. And I know you guys implemented OneTrust and Adobe OptIn, right? So what is Adobe OptIn? You know, that's the question I have here. And what happens if I don't enable it, Raj?
Yeah, so basically, I mean, you cannot comply with these privacy laws by just having a CMP on a website. So CMP basically comes handy, and it helps users to, it helps clients to grab users' consent. But that consent, once it's there, it has to be ingested by Adobe systems, and then Adobe then based on the consent, then Adobe decides like what beacon should fire, should not fire, is cookie should get set or not set. So that happens inside the Adobe OptIn service. So, I mean, if I have to talk about DTM days, right, there was no Adobe OptIn service. And the only thing that you could have done is based on the consent values, you could have put the checks inside the DTM rules, and then you could have stopped the beacons. But still, your Adobe Analytics and Target and AAM libraries gets load. And as soon as they load, they start setting cookies. And that's where it violates GDPR. So this is only possible if you use Adobe OptIn service, because Adobe OptIn service, based on the consent value that a user sets, you can completely block all these libraries from setting cookies and sending the beacons. So that's where you get 100% compliant with GDPR or any other act. So you need to have both things parallel, and that too, working hand in hand, CMP and Adobe OptIn service.
Okay. Yeah. And that Adobe OptIn service, when I heard about what you guys did, that was the news to me, right? Like I'd never really heard of Adobe OptIn. I think I've had read about it. But typically implementations only, encompass the CMP, right? The content management platforms and so on. So it's super, super important, right? To enable that. What happens if I don't enable it?
So as I just said, if you don't use Adobe OptIn service, which I've seen which is the case with many of the clients, what they do, they just use the consent value and the flags, and they put the checks inside the launch rules, and then you end up stopping all the beacons from firing. But that's just one side of the compliance. GDPR compliance is more strict towards cookies rather than just the tracking beacons, right? So you should not let anyone set cookies unless and until someone opts in. So if you want your analytics library or the target library or audience or any other library from setting the cookies, Adobe OptIn is the only solution for that problem.
Okay. So how do I enable it?
Yeah. So what happens when Adobe Launch loads? ECID extension is the first thing that loads, and thankfully Adobe has integrated this OptIn service inside the ECID extension only. So you can use Adobe ECID extension. There's a entire box, and that is called as OptIn service. And then within OptIn service, there are a bunch of options. You can choose those, and you can comply with any of the Privacy Act.
Okay.
So
all right.
Everything happens inside ECID extension. Yeah.
Got it. Built into the ECID extension. Okay, great.
Yep.
And so once you guys implemented that, right? You guys implemented OneTrust, you guys implemented Adobe OptIn. What sort of impacts did you see during the rollout? Do you mind sharing some insights, Jay?
Yeah. Let's start by saying what we anticipated, right? So when somebody like Justin comes to me and says, "Hey, we want to start doing our privacy rollout," the first thing that that came to my mind, and hopefully comes to everybody's mind, is when we turn this on, what do we expect to happen, right? We're asking for opt-out requests to be honored. We're asking for cessation of data collection, right? So how much are we going to lose? What's the impact on our bottom line going to be from a data perspective? So to estimate that, we took a pretty simple approach and said, let's just assume that all bounce traffic, it's gone, right? Like those people are going to show up, and under the strictest regulations, something like GDPR, we're going to see that they are defaulted to an opt-out state. And even if they opt in, because they're bouncing, we're never going to get a chance to collect any data from them. So we can just real quick look at our traffic and say, what's our bounce traffic? That's all gone, right? We're not even going to know they came to the site. That's starter. Then you can augment that a little bit and say, what about the people who do opt in, right? Like they have to do something else that would have sent off data. So people who would have came to the site and maybe interacted with content that wasn't necessarily tagged, but still interacted, we're going to lose that too. So you can up the number a little bit. And when we went and ran the numbers for Bayer Crop Sciences, our estimate going in was 75% of data loss in Europe. That was our starting point. When we got to the real data loss in Europe, it was worse than what we had hoped for. It was close to 85% across most of Europe, and in Latin America, it was well above 90% most of the time. For contrast, of course, we've got the US where CCPA is in place, and the default is to opt people in, and data loss there was significantly smaller, usually in the 2 to 5% range, depending on what time frame we looked in. So it gives you a good contrast in two studies right there, where we say what's the impact of implied opt-in versus implied opt-out, and it's pretty substantial, especially in Europe and Latin America.
Okay, and I have some slides here you guys shared with me as well to help drive that point. Should be sharing right now. So as you can see in the US, a lot of opt-in rates, very high opt-in rates. US 98%, Canada 90%, Mexico 88%. Then we have the EU. Purple's not good here.
No, it's
Purple
not.
and blue is not good. But yeah, very low ones. And then Latin America, were you guys expecting to see such low opt-in rates in Latin America as well?
That one blew me out of the water. I figured it would be online with what we saw in Europe, right? It was crazy how often people stayed in the opt-out state in the Latin America region. So this was by far the thing that jumped out to me the most as we rolled this out across the globe, that the Latin America region, they really like to stay opted out. They don't opt in as often as their European counterparts.
That's interesting. And so, Justin, I have a question here. So in Latin America, how come you guys decided to apply GDPR here?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And so for us, Bayer Crop Science, who is headquartered in Germany, which, right, is a GDPR state, when we went and made some decisions around our global strategy, right, we were thinking through what is the international scope of privacy, and how do we think through, right, those countries that don't have a privacy regulation yet, the countries that are going to have privacy regulations in the future, and how do we future-proof so that when these new privacy regulations come up, our speed to market is significantly faster, so that we are not spending multiple months and budget, right, trying to spin up a project to get things done. And so what we chose to do from a conservative perspective was we went with applying GDPR everywhere that Bayer Crop Science has a website outside of the United States. So we do apply CCPA and subsequently CPRA, right, or CDPA in the future in the US, but anywhere else, right, we really look at applying GDPR everywhere from a conservative perspective.
Okay.
When we think about Latin America, that was helpful for us, mainly because we future-proofed. Brazil was something easy for us to apply, since there are so many synergies between LGPD and GDPR. So that's where we are today and where we're going in the future. But this is why that future proofing is so important, and why it made our lives a lot easier for this use case.
Okay. And I like how you guys are thinking about future proofing, and especially now that we know that applying consent management outside the US will result in catastrophic data loss. How can organizations plan ahead to mitigate this catastrophic data loss, right? So how did you guys approach this? We'll start with Raj.
Oh yeah. So this is something, as Jay mentioned, we anticipated, we knew that this is going to happen, and there are so many clients who really worry about this. Like once they apply with GDPR, all their data will be gone. So yeah, there are some solutions that you can definitely plan ahead and you can think of while grabbing some data. I won't see like you'll be having exact same data. So there are some things that that comes under gray area. So first of all, you need to really work with your privacy team and legal team to identify what comes under as per the, because every company and every privacy and legal team has their own terms of complying with these acts. So you need to really closely work with these teams and the experts, and to figure out what comes under this Privacy Act and what is okay, what is not okay. Okay, and in case of Bayer Crop Science, what we did, we decided, let's do one thing. Let's try to grab data, very minimal data, okay, which won't be obviously which will be complying under the GDPR hood, and we are making sure that we are getting every minimal data which we require, but we are not tracking anything extravagant. Okay, so we came up with this approach of having a hard-coded beacon where you just end up tracking very minimal data about the user, for example, like page views and domain information, stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay, so this is that fallback tracking you guys shared me a slide about, right? So let me share that slide as well.
And Raj, if you don't mind, I just want to mention real quick the thought process that we took when it came to designing a fallback data model was the old school idea of server-side tracking. A lot of the regulations that are out there these days, as Justin mentioned earlier, apply largely to all the things around cookies and client-side data collection. But at the end of the day, a company, let's just pretend the worst case scenario came along and client-side data collection of any sort was never allowed, right? A company like Bayer still has the ability to go in and do server-side analysis. They can still see what pages were served up, how often they were served up, and what type of general interactions occurred with those pages, because that's all collected by their own servers. So the idea was to sit back and say, well, how can we mimic something to that effect from a data model, but do it with client-side tracking, right? So that we're not losing that client-side data collection, but we're also not pushing the bounds of the legality, right? We're not trying to find ways to skirt the law here. Instead, we're trying to say, how can we do this and stay within the law and continue with the current paradigm that we're all used to, which is client-side data collection. And that's what led to this fallback scenario here.
Okay, and I think that's, oh, you go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, well, I think the one thing that I would add to that as well, and I would really recommend to anyone thinking about taking this approach, right? One of the big things that we had to think about was aligning, like Raj and Jay have said, with our actual legal team, since we're not the attorneys, to understand what their interpretation of these laws are. The other thing that we had to also do within Adobe was to create a governance process over every single data point that we collect, so that we understand how we identify them from a personal identifiable data perspective, as well as sensitive identifiable information. And so while we did go this route, we also did it with the guidance of our legal team. And I want to make sure I point that out and recommend that to anyone who does this at their respective company as well.
Right. Yeah. Aligning with legal is a quite important step here, right? And that's what I wanted to point out. Like even though you guys are still capturing some tracking or some beacon, some data, it's it's within the legal boundaries, and that's really cool. So Raj, walk us through this.
Oh yeah. So first of all, we termed it fallback tracking. It's a pretty interesting name. It might become an industry standard one day. You never know. So yeah, speaking about fallback tracking, as the name says, if someone is not opting in, so definitely you cannot track everything what you would track in an opt-in scenario. So in that case, we decided to come up with this strategy where we have hard-coded beacons. I hope that reminds you of no JavaScript days, right? So where you used to put a very simple beacon and you used to fire everything and grab everything, which is very important. So yeah, as you can see, that helped us in generate 100% of the interactions data, and we tried to kept things really minimal, like page, domain, and some other measurements like somebody opting in, opting out, all that data. And we also made sure that no cookies are getting deployed, because cookie is something which people take lightly, but when it comes to GDPR is more strict towards cookies rather than the beacons. Right, because in this scenario, especially fallback tracking, we are still firing a beacon, but we are making sure that no cookie is getting set. Okay, so that is something we thought of, And then obviously, as I mentioned, it's a hard-coded server call. And yeah, I mean, it obviously has advantage, a lot of advantage over not having any data getting tracked. But it comes with a some downside, which is that it sometimes, not sometimes, it will, like, obviously if somebody is opting in after a certain point in time, then that user gets counted in two ways. Like, first, it gets counted in through a fallback tracking, which would be a fallback ID. And then, once it opts in, then the ECID kicks in, and then that user will get identified as MID. So a same user might get quanted twice. But we came with a solution for that. Maybe Jay can answer on that.
Yeah, our big solution there was to set up a dimension and a metric to identify each hit as opt-in or opt-out. So we could then segment the appropriate data sets. That way we didn't have to worry about somehow mistakenly doing analysis on data sets that included both opt-in and opt-out hits. So we have the ability to essentially to just say, don't show me any opt-out hits if we want to do an analysis on the full data set. And then if we want to do reporting back to somebody like Justin and say, hey, what's your opt-in rate these days? We can quickly and easily, through the use of a single dimension, just give him percentages and show that trended over time.
Okay, that's cool. So one highlight here. So the hard-coded server call, that means you guys you're essentially building the URL yourselves. You're constructing that beacon manually, without using the library, right? Because the library would still set the cookie and capture some data that's not wanted, right? But you guys, just knowing the essentials and the building blocks of everything, you guys went ahead and built this manually.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and Raj, are you going to show them an example of the server call? Do you have that in here?
See what we got.
We don't have it in the deck.
Okay. I think the one thing I'll call out then, if you've seen, anytime anybody has done any sort of like debugging, packet sniffing, whatever, and you've seen the server call that goes off to analytics, this one, of course, is massively pared down. The big thing that we discovered through this is that it's critical to include a parameter, CL, Charlie Lima, equals none. It's actually spelled out NONE. That's cookie lifetime. And that's the method that ensures that you do not deploy a cookie. When our very first iteration of this, we did not have that parameter on the server call. And instead of getting the fallback ID that we expected, we got the old school S_VI cookie that came through on about a third of mostly mobile traffic. It was really, really specific to where it came through. But we completely, like 100% eradicated that by adding the CL equals none parameter to the hard-coded call.
Okay. Very interesting. All right. So what about, when somebody is accepting a consent management, right? And they select to let me just stop sharing here. They select that, yes, I would like to opt in, or no, I would not like to opt in. Some solutions, you sort of refresh the page immediately, right? Others you don't. Are there any considerations around that, Jay? In terms of forcing a page refresh, or just knowing the foundation or the building blocks, that you can control with a tag management system. Would you collect that data another way?
Yeah, so in our case, we went with a direct call. As soon as somebody opted in, there's a property through OneTrust called the OneTrust Active Group. Did I get that right, Raj? OneTrust Active Groups. That's on the page, and it contains all the different settings. So we were able to just monitor that particular object for a change in state to determine if we wanted to send in a direct beacon. The upside we're finding now, as we're getting ready to roll out Target onto these sites, is that we're not walking ourselves into a potentially awkward situation where somebody is opted in by default over in Europe, and then they opt in and suddenly the page refreshes and personalization gets applied. So the page had an all blue background and suddenly it turns green because they opted in, or it didn't know where they were and it suddenly says, hey, we know you're in the Czech Republic all of a sudden, right? Which could be creepy to some people, depending on their familiarity with this industry. So the approach to refresh the page, we're trying to avoid that in the first place, but now we're finding down the road that this has ancillary benefits to key off of that object and to fire a direct server call and to not refresh the page.
Okay. Yeah, and that's key, right? You know, so it's not only knowing that you need to implement a consent management platform, not only you need to implement Adobe OptIn, if you're using personalization tools like Target, managing, you know, how you're capturing that and the user experience, you need to keep that in mind as well. All right, so let's try to think about, you know, you guys spoke about what you did for Bayer. You shared some learnings. You know, a generalized approach, right? So how do you guys recommend, you know, the people on this, you know, call to approach this on their own clients or their own, you know, implementations, right? So Jay, punt that
Yeah,
one to you.
yeah. If we had to generalize this process, right? Like, I think one of the things that we want to make sure we're clear about here is what we did at Bayer was heavily customized to their particular setup, right? They're
Yeah.
massively international company. You may be dealing with a business that's more regional in nature, right? For example, in France, the CNIL regulations, they actually have methodology you can follow. If you can check a few boxes, you're allowed to actually collect a lot of analytics data there. So it's important right up front then, because of these massively different and wide-reaching regulations that are out there, to start, as Justin mentioned earlier, with the legal and the privacy team, right? So it doesn't matter what company you're at. It could be the smallest one that's just in one country of the world. It could be the biggest one that's literally, you know, multi-continent. You need to have legal teams involved to help interpret the laws. Especially like in my case, if you're a consulting or an agency entity that's involved, you don't want to be on a hook for making recommendations to these companies that they're going to come back then and hold you liable for what you've recommended, right? Their legal team needs to interpret this. They need to determine what's right and what's best for them. So that's step number one. Step number two is make sure you know what your consent management platform is, right? We've talked about OneTrust exclusively in this example, but it doesn't have to be OneTrust in the future. So what consent management product you use will determine what features and functionality are available to you, right? For example, OneTrust, we've talked about a lot of great things we got out of this, but Justin, we're still dealing with the fact that we have to apply regulations based on domain and where that country is at. We're not doing it at the user level right now because OneTrust, unfortunately, does not surface a location identifier for that person. So we can't tell, for example, if someone from Germany is looking at a site in the US, we will apply CCPA to them and we'll capture everything, which is, you know, technically speaking, it's going to be in violation of some law, right? But we're doing it with the best information that's available to us. And so hopefully you can find through your consent management platform what's the best information that's available to you, and you can determine how to customize your approach from there. Again, once you've got this idea of like who's the legal partner, who is, what is the technical platform that's involved, who's the product manager for these, right? We've got Justin. It's great. He wasn't involved with this when we first got started, right? We had to deal with the legal team in Germany. Then Justin came on board. It was great having him as a liaison there so he could take on a lot of this work. He also owned the OneTrust platform. So this was a nice nexus for us because he was both the technological platform owner and the legal liaison. It may not be that way with the companies you're working with. You may have separation of duties there. And then, as Justin mentioned, the big thing is determining the regulations, right? Like we've gone with largely a two-model, a binary process, CCPA in the US, GDPR everywhere else, with the idea that GDPR is the most strict of the models that we have to follow. And if we can follow it, we're probably going to be, you know, compliant with all the other models that are out there. Maybe you don't have that same situation. Maybe your legal team wants to, you know, apply very, very fine-tooth regulations. Maybe you want to, you know, you operate in France and you want to take advantage of CNIL and all the data collection you can do there. Great, go for it, right? That's up to you guys to determine. You know, again, we went with the scalable approach, and that's why we did it at Bayer. But your approach may be much more detailed and fine-tooth there. Lastly, we cannot overstate the value of having that fallback tracking in place, right? Get data from the places you're not supposed to collect data, right? And again, within bounds, don't break the law, right? We're not saying try to skirt the law here. What we're saying is look at the law as not a black and white, a 1-0 yes, no scenario. There is a little bit of gray area in there where you're not going to be violating the law. You're not going to be violating the spirit of the law. You can still collect data and not destroy your business needs, right? So that's the generalization of the approach that I would take, those four and a half steps there.
Okay. All right. All right. So you have something else, Raj? Did you say you were no? Okay, sorry about that. So I wanna.
Just to,
Oh, I think Raj is frozen.
yes.
Raj, you there? We lost Raj. Justin, do you have something?
No, I think
Me
Jay
now?
really eloquently put all of my thoughts out there already. So I think I'm good for now.
Okay, Raj, we got you back.
Yeah, so just to add on what Jay said, so I have even science and you can even get
Raj, think your connection.
can you guys hear me now?
No, we can't. But let's move on, and if it if it gets back on, we'll get back to you. But I do want to do one thing. So I wanna wrap up some of the key takeaways that you guys have kind of sprinkled us with. So the first one is, again, it's not only OneTrust, not only content management. You also need, if you're in the Adobe stack, obviously, Adobe OptIn. Not only think about analytics, think about target. And then, obviously align with legal. I think, with my experience as well in working with some clients, legal's always they're almost never there, which is surprisingly interesting. And when you do get them, it's extremely helpful, right? And, having a product owner like Justin, I haven't had the pleasure to work with someone like Justin and a client before, so I'm sure it'll make things a lot better. And then, even though we shared a very customized approach here, generalize it to what you guys are doing. And with that question, I have one question for Justin now. In terms of this approach that we've outlined, how are you guys approaching globalizing that strategy now that you have all this data, and now that things are changing across the world and so on?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when I joined the organization back last year, we didn't have a fully defined understanding, right, of what international data privacy looks like. We had never done a full discovery on this is what we have to do everywhere so we can get away from localization. And so a lot of it was really just speed to market. How can we make sure that we're fully compliant? If you guys are using Adobe and OneTrust and Adobe Launch and you have not done that configuration to make sure they work together, I would highly recommend you work with OneTrust to get that documentation, right? We found that we were putting OneTrust in places where OneTrust wasn't actually working as expected, right? So we were already out of compliance. And so we had to implement this, right? And this whole fallback tracking process started with, how do we just get compliant? And so now we're shifting this global holistic strategy from, hey, how do we get compliance? How do we make sure that we're thinking locally, but thinking globally? And how do we put privacy on top of the user experience to now, how do we make this a part of our customer journeys? How do we make this a part of the omni-channel experience? How do we make this the walled garden that puts privacy in as a natural dependency on everything else that we do in the marketing space? So how do we think about consents from the back end, not just cookies, right? So if we're Bayer and we are giving someone a line of credit for their farmers and they're giving us consent to run their credit, how are we meshing that in with OneTrust so that we have a single view of the user? And so we're really trying to look at it from the full scope of the person and not just that single way that the person is trying to come to us. And so kind of like we said when we started, right? What we're talking about is just a sliver of what privacy really looks like here at Bayer and across the world. And so for us, we're really trying to look at how do we do the whole thing? And how do we do the whole thing for 30 million users? And that's the fun part of figuring that out and then making that something that goes live.
Okay. Yeah, and you speak to something, that we touched on earlier in the beginning is, this is just a tiny little piece, right, of complying with your privacy regulation, right? There are a lot of other, aspects to it. We have a slide here that really, breaks that out. So what the solution that we spoke about is and what it is not. So Jay, do you want to walk us through this?
Yeah. Yours is coming up here, so I'm going to grab mine locally here. There we go. All right, see it now. Yeah, so what we were talking about here was specifically today was around measurement scenarios. We did not talk about data storage, right? A lot of regulations in a lot of countries now are starting to pass laws that data collected in their country has to be stored in their country. We're not addressing that particular concern in this solution, right? This is just a measurement tactic. We're also not dealing with the data governance side. So something like GDPR, CCPA, they both have generalized what we would call access and delete needs. So the ability to see what's been collected about a person or to delete, the right to be forgotten, so to speak. We're not addressing that topic here either, right? That's a whole different ball of wax, and it's a pretty big one. And while we have dealt with it at Bayer, that's not part of our presentation today, right? Again, focus solely on data measurement. How can we collect data while we're honoring opt-in and opt-out scenarios? This again was built for an international company, so I wouldn't follow this step by step unless you were, happen to exactly have the same layout here. And while we did do this without generating cookies in a certain scenario, I want to be clear that this is not a cookieless implementation. In fact, the whole concept of cookieless implementation, I get into a lot of conversations with a lot of companies where they say they want to do cookieless implementation and cookieless data collection, and they think that has something to do with privacy. But the two are actually completely unrelated from a technical standpoint. And what we did here, even though we did go a route where we did not use a cookie, we're not actually building an entire cookieless solution. When somebody's opted in, we still go with first-party cookies. We're still using the visitor ID service, and it's still doing everything it's supposed to do. So if you're being asked to do a cookieless implementation at your job, don't take this approach. This is completely different than privacy. And then, of course, what we talked about here, this is we scaled this for global in nature, but we had a heavy focus on what the EU brings to the table from a legality standpoint.
Right. And here's a quote that we thought was interesting, where so far it was cheaper to ignore privacy rights, but now hopefully it's going to be cheaper, to follow them because the penalties are so high. So this is a really, important topic, right, for your organizations. So with that, we are at the end of the content we wanted to share. We have a lot of Q&A, a lot of, activity here. I'll start with one question that Mitchell Teixeira asked, around Telium. And he's asking if Adobe OptIn is similar to the overlapping Telium consent manager, right? And I think Raj, you answered there that it's the Telium consent manager is more of like a consent management platform, more equivalent to OneTrust. I agree with that. And Mitchell, you had something else here. You may be thinking about Telium Privacy Manager. Telium Consent Manager picks up what OneTrust leaves behind and governs the tags. That's what I'm comparing to Adobe OptIn. How do we want to answer this question? I think, Mitchell, the answer to that question is probably no, because Adobe OptIn is more like an Adobe internal feature, right? That governs the Adobe stack. Does anyone, Justin, maybe you from Adobe, do you have any I know we're talking about Telium now, but do you have any insight on that?
Not as much, right? So I know I've worked with Telium at a different company, TD Ameritrade. But at that point, we weren't using OneTrust to govern our tags, but we were using it, right, as the container similar to what we were using Adobe Launch for. So to answer the question directly, are there similarities? Absolutely, right? Because we use that for our cookie banner solution, for example. Like if you go to tdameritrade.com, that's a Telium solve. But I'm not confident enough to say how similar it is, just enough to say that, yes, it is similar in some ways.
Yeah. All right. Anyone have anything to add there? Okay, Mitchell, hopefully that was good enough. We have another one from Jason. We use Adobe Launch, Adobe Analytics, and OneTrust. Can fallback method, hard-coded calls be set through Adobe Launch? Is there a technical guidance we can follow? Also, would collecting revenues orders for opt-out users be advisable? Do we use different Adobe report suite for such traffic, or same reports would be okay? That's a lot to unpack. But Raj, I know you wanted to answer this question live.
Actually, we did it. So what we did, we use an EVAR, or you can use an EVAR to capture the scenario, like if a user was in opt-in state or opt-out state, and then based on that, you can use a segment to segregate the users into the different virtual report suites. So you don't have to really use two report suites. I think, Jay, this is what we did for Bayer, right? Using the concept of virtual report suite to segregate users.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So
and then to his question about using Launch to actually send the call, do you want to talk about how, from an implementation standpoint, you actually like send off the beacon?
Yeah, I can share my screen.
Okay, we're going demos, live demos.
While he's doing that, let me answer the revenue question real quick here. So my answer to that one is that's probably okay, but I would talk to your privacy consent contact there at your company. At the end of the day, all of these questions about what, if you're asking yourself, is it okay to collect this? The answer is, that's not my job to answer that. That's always your legal and compliance representative. They're the ones who answer, is it okay? My guess, from my vantage point as a not lawyer, is that it's okay to collect a lot of information, especially if you're not collecting an actual like visitor ID and deploying a cookie and everything. And so I would assume revenues and orders are okay. Again, think about the server side comparison, right? If you didn't collect orders and revenues, that still gets collected on your side, in your actual technology stack. That information is known, right? It's just because it's not, just because you're not collecting it on the client side, it doesn't mean there is a lack of a server side presence of that data. So the conversation I would recommend having with your representative there who would make that decision is just describing that scenario, saying, look, I can get this information this way. It just is a lot more work. How about we just go ahead and say it's cool here, right? And just get their take on it. And they'll know their law, hopefully, and their regulation, and we'll be able to actually answer that question and then make sure you get that documented. So if anybody comes back and complains later, you can tell them it was they're the ones who approved it.
Right.
Yeah.
And certainly not legal advice.
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
absolutely.
And to add on to that, what I would also recommend you do with that legal team is really, when you think about revenue and orders, right? What I'm hearing is a segmentation between the unauthenticated user experience, which is what the vast majority of this call is on, right? So like prospects or users who are not logged in to access your website, right? That's where the majority of our first and third party tracking happens. But what we're really talking about when we think about revenue is that authenticated experience when a user is logged in. So theoretically, we already have information on them, like their name, their email address, payment information if they're giving us an order. And so typically you have two separate worlds from a privacy policy perspective, right? On what we're collecting, how and why. And so I think that's really important, why it's important. That's why it will be important to talk to that legal team, since there will be some things as an organization you have to capture no matter what, even in an opt-out state. And we have to determine what that looks like for those users whom have opted to give us their information in exchange for doing business with us as an organization. So that's going to be an important line for each organization to draw. And hopefully that helps the question.
See, this is why you want your legal guys here.
Yes.
They answer the question way more confidently than I ever will.
Yeah, sure.
Yep. And even I have seen clients where, they completely whitelist the analytics. They say like analytics is completely whitelist. You can track anything given that you're not tracking PIIs. Right. So yeah, it completely depends on your legal team, how they define, what they define in whitelist and blacklist. So yeah, coming back on to what I have on my screen. So this is how we created hard-coded image request. Again, it's pretty simple, nothing rocket science going on here. So you can see from row number 9 to 17, these are some of the data items we thought would be super important to track, even if it's a hard-coded scenario. So here you can see we have a flag getting into a prop 20. And based on this variable, so we are passing opted out in case of opted out, and we are passing opted in case of when we have a consent or CCPA, right? Implied scenario. So based on this, we can obviously segregate our users into two different virtual report suites. And then something to note on row number 20 is that what Jay was talking about and mentioning earlier, which is CL equals to none. So this is a parameter that you should set in your hard-coded image request. That would ensure that no cookie is getting set while you're setting this. Otherwise, if you don't use this, the hard-coded beacon will still still set some of the cookies, something like FID or S_VR, something like that. So yeah, to ensure that no cookies getting set and you are 100% compliant, don't forget to use CL equals to none. But yeah, apart from that, I think it's pretty simple. I think it reminds you of the good old days when we didn't used to have JavaScript on some of the browsers. So right. Yeah, that's pretty much about it. And any questions here?
Any follow-up questions? Well, I know there's one more question around if somebody, by mistake opts out, but then for some reason they want to opt back in, out of the goodness of their heart. Then in that case, it depends on the vendor, right? You typically can do that, right? And you can, leave an option to do that, right? And so on. Cool. All right. Well, we're 2 minutes over what we typically want to, keep webinars at, 45 minutes. So thank you all for attending. Thank you, Justin, Jay, Raj, for these super insightful, lessons. and hope to have you guys back in some other webinar. And yeah, thanks for everyone.
Yep. Thanks for having us, JP.
Guys.
All right, guys.